Hello, I'm Ash,
And I'm Joel.
and welcome to Back-to-Back Horror Stories, where we tell you a few different strange and/or creepy stories back to back.
Today's video includes 2 stories featuring the paranormal. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, I should start this story by introducing you to the person who it comes from. So all we know is that her name is Jill, and that she's closely associated with a well-known paranormal researcher by the name of Tim Weisberg. Jill's last name is not publicly available, nor relevant to her experience. However, her story is interesting, and it's about something that terrifies us all. Haunted dolls. So yeah, buckle up for this one. According to her, when she was about 8 years old, she received a gift from a family friend named Miss Marion. Evidently, Miss Marion was frequently stopping by her family's home and giving her gifts. And this time, the gift just so happened to be a small porcelain doll. Upon giving it to Jill, Miss Marion made sure to mention that the reason that she was doing this was because she thought the doll bore a close resemblance to Jill. And frankly, it did. They both had brown eyes and rosy cheeks and brown hair. And so despite the fact that Jill wasn't really big into dolls, she took the gift anyway and named it Claire. Now, most of the time, Claire the doll was sitting upright in a small rocking chair next to Jill's closet and dresser. And so really, Jill's only concern, at least at first, was the constant eye contact between her and Claire, and not much else. But then something happened that she found to be a bit unsettling. One night, while Jill was reading ghost stories in her bedroom, a carousel horse on her dresser suddenly turned on and began playing music. And it wasn't just playing a few notes, it was playing the entire song as if someone had just wound it up, which was of course impossible because nobody else was in the bedroom except for her and Claire. But after playing for a bit, it then stopped, just as suddenly as it started. Something that also didn't make any sense, because typically it would wind down slowly. Regardless, Jill didn't run to her parents about it or anything. She just shrugged it off and didn't think about it for a while. But over a period of time, more and more things began to take place that defied convention. Shortly after the first incident, Jill started having the same terrible nightmare practically every night. The way it would go was that she would be lying in her bed, a woman would get extremely close to her face, and the woman would wake her up by shouting, "Jill, wake up!" After that, she would then look around her bedroom and just sit there wondering where the voice came from. Jill says that she dealt with this reoccurring nightmare for several months before it subsided and transferred to her brother and then ultimately her father. And apparently, she herself still has this nightmare every now and again, even to this day. But not long after her marathon of nightmares faded into the background, Jill started to get fed up with all the little things that would happen around Claire. On top of the stuff we've already mentioned, from the moment Claire came into Jill's possession, there were a bunch of minor, sort of annoying things she experienced. One of the things that took place frequently was that she would have personal items go missing and later find them next to Claire. Like, for example, there was the famous ring incident where she spent a lot of time looking for a ring and found it in Claire's pocket. Additionally, Jill oftentimes smelled perfume in the air near the doll, despite not spraying any, and books fell off of her shelves for no reason. But compared to what would happen next, all of that would be pretty innocuous. In fact, the next part of this story was and is so terrifying that certain aspects of it still haunt Jill to this day. So one evening, Jill went to bed and woke up to a loud thumping sound in the middle of the night. As for where it was coming from, she had no idea. But then, as she sat up in her bed and looked around, she found herself drawn to the nightlight. And it was here, in front of the nightlight, that Claire the doll typically sat positioned upright on her little rocking chair. So after Jill took a closer look, she finally figured out where the thumping sound was coming from. It was, of course, the rocking chair, which was now moving back and forth by itself, despite the fact that Jill had thick shag carpet. So right away, it's safe to say that seeing this made the hairs on the back of Jill's neck stand up. But when Jill started looking at Claire more closely, she witnessed something even worse. First, she noticed Claire's feet, which were typically facing the opposite side of each other, suddenly straighten out and start pointing upward. Next, she saw Claire's head slowly begin to turn in her direction before ultimately making full eye contact with her. And then finally, as the intense eye contact began, all 4 music boxes in her room began playing at once. So needless to say, at this point, it was all just too much. Immediately, Jill began yelling for her parents, and the music stopped. And from that point forward, Jill was done with Claire the doll. She took her, put her into a box, and placed her in the back of a storage closet where the doll remained for a long time, until Jill wound up coming into contact with Tim Weisberg. Then Jill sent the doll to him, and Claire stayed at his house for a few months. And he too experienced strange activity around the doll, including temperature shifts and hearing voices. But a few of the things that Jill found out later about Claire the doll's origins were pretty interesting. So, first of all, it seems pretty clear that the lady that gifted Claire to Jill, Miss Marion, was well aware of the doll's issues and likely just wanted to get rid of her. In fact, while owning the doll, Miss Marion had experienced several weird occurrences, such as disembodied voices coming from nowhere, glass breaking, and cigar smoke materializing out of thin air. Additionally, the doll itself wound up in various locations around her home without having been put there. But as for where it came from initially, Miss Marion really had no idea. Claire the doll was apparently discovered in one of her closets, and Miss Marion was simply never able to recall exactly who gave it to her and why. So yeah, that's pretty weird. But anyways, guys, I think we can all agree that it's probably for the best that Claire the doll goes back into the closet for a while. Some toys just aren't meant to be played with.
The following story is featured in an interesting little book called Unexplainable Happenings, Chilling True Stories Volume 2. And it comes from a man by the name of Manuel, who has a young son named Arthur. Now, apparently Arthur has had severe anxiety from the moment of birth. And although his parents initially wrote off this anxiety as just being part of their son's nature, they've recently come to the conclusion that it's a whole lot more than just that. So one day when Arthur was around 4 years old, his father Manuel and his mother Laura decided to take him to a museum. As they were driving on the way there, they stopped at a stoplight, and Arthur, who was in the back seat, began to have one of his panic attacks. This was something that happened every now and again. But right away, he started screaming at his parents and telling them not to go when the light turned green. To which Manuel, who was at the wheel, replied back that, well, he had to because there were cars waiting behind them, and so he couldn't just not go. But when the light did turn green and the car that was in front of them started to accelerate, Arthur immediately began trying to escape from the vehicle. He opened the car door and he tried to get out. So, thinking quickly, Manuel jumped out of the vehicle and went to go shut the door in order to stop Arthur from escaping. But as Manuel finished doing so and was likely about to reprimand Arthur for this behavior, he suddenly heard loud screams and honking coming from his left. And when Manuel then turned to see what all the fuss was about, what he saw was absolutely petrifying. Evidently, the car right in front of them that had gone when the light turned green was involved in a horrible collision. A vehicle from the other side of the intersection had run a red light and crashed into the car, leading to the driver being sent flying out of the vehicle and dying shortly after impact. And so, after witnessing this awful event, Manuel and Laura decided to return home instead of taking Arthur to the museum. However, they were now fully convinced that Arthur possessed some form of clairvoyant ability. And several months after this, they would have even more evidence to back that theory up. So during a day spent at home with nothing interesting really going on, Arthur casually walked up to his father and told him that he didn't want his grandmother to die. To which Manuel replied, "Well, what makes you say that? Grandma isn't dying." "She has cancer," Arthur responded. And then Manuel interrogated his son on how he knew this particular piece of information and if he even understood what cancer was. And Arthur said that, well, no, he didn't know what cancer was, but he did know the amount of time left that his grandma had to live. And that was 2 months. And unfortunately, 2 months after Arthur made this prediction, Manuel's mother and Arthur's grandma did die of cancer. But what came after her death was even more than just grief. Approximately a year later, when Manuel was picking up his now 5-year-old son from preschool, Arthur once again began making some interesting remarks. He apparently wanted to talk about his grandma, and so he asked his father, "Well, she's not in heaven or hell. Where is she?" To which Manuel responded, "She's in heaven, sweetie. What makes you say that she's not?" "Because I see her all the time," Arthur said. "Where?" Manuel replied. "Staring at me while I'm sleeping," said Arthur. "Does she talk to you?" replied Manuel. "No, she only stares and keeps me up all night." So, needless to say, Manuel found this entire conversation a bit strange. But later that night, he decided to sleep in Arthur's room with him to see if he could catch any paranormal activity going on. And sometime in the middle of the night, Arthur woke his father up and pointed in the direction of the doorway. "She's right there," Arthur said quietly. Then Manuel looked over himself, and although the door was now wide open, he didn't see anything. Just in case whatever Arthur had seen was actually his grandma, though, Arthur did smile in that direction. And the rest of the night, nothing crazy happened. But then, a few weeks after this, Manuel once again slept in Arthur's bedroom with him, hoping to see Grandma again. And this time, things turned out a whole lot different than the first night. So once again, Manuel fell asleep and Arthur woke him up. But this time, Arthur was in a state of fear. While looking at the ceiling above them, Arthur remained perfectly quiet and didn't make a peep. And so, figuring Arthur had just seen Grandma again, Manuel looked up as well and smiled at her and said, "Hi, Mom." To which Arthur quietly replied, "That's not Grandma." Then Manuel asked, "What?" To which Arthur replied, "Her eyes are all black." And Manuel replied, "What's she doing?" "Crawling on the ceiling," Arthur said. And then a single tear rolled down his cheek. After that, Manuel looked up at the ceiling again and still didn't see anything. Meanwhile, though, Arthur started kicking and screaming, "Go away! Go away!" And so, recognizing how frightening this whole thing was for his son, Manuel picked Arthur up, brought him into the master bedroom where his wife Laura was now fully awake because of all the screaming, and well, that's where the family slept for the rest of the night. Well, sort of. I mean, their sleep was pretty restless and Arthur cried for the whole night, which was understandable considering what he had just seen. But as for what that was, well, Manuel and Laura were pretty curious too. And so the following morning during breakfast, they asked Arthur to explain in further detail exactly what he had witnessed. And Arthur claimed that the figure he saw was like a dead person imitating his grandmother. Now, it looked similar to Grandma, but it had black holes for eyes and a demonic-looking smile. And this was different from prior sightings of his grandmother because normally she would be at the foot of the bed or in the doorway, but this time she was crawling on the ceiling. So anyway, after a year of more and more sightings similar to this one, Manuel and his wife Laura ultimately decided to bring in a priest to cleanse the home of any malevolent spirits or bad energy. And according to Manuel, it worked. From then on, Arthur never saw any bad spirits or anything in the home again. However, he apparently retained the ability to predict events. And relatively recently, while Manuel and his family were visiting relatives in Memphis, they stopped by a gas station to get some things. And before going in, Arthur once again had a panic attack, urging them not to go in. Then, a few days later, they learned that there was a robbery at that same gas station on the same night that they were there. All right, guys, that's going to do it for us today.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe.
Also, if you have any idea for content you'd like us to make in the future, please let us know in the comments below, and it could end up being in a future video. Thank you for watching.